Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you. Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the impact of racism on service provision for autistic people. So I think a good place to start would be really kind of establishing what racism is. So in terms of racism, we need to first distinguish between prejudice and discrimination also. And prejudice being the preconceived thoughts or feelings formed towards a group of people that share a common characteristic without knowledge or reason. Prejudice is something that everyone, most people, if not everyone, has really, if we're honest with ourselves. And these are just these thoughts and feelings that we have based on our own histories or kind of experiences or what we're exposed to, that we kind of feel about a group of people. Now, when we talk about discrimination, we talk about acting upon those prejudiced feelings and thoughts, and it's directly kind of treating a group of people that share a common characteristic unfavourably. And then the real distinction with racism is when prejudice and discrimination are upheld by a dominant or more powerful race, that's when we're looking at racism. And in terms of racism, it really stems from a different history and impacts different racial groups in different ways. And that's really important because people's experiences of racism can be very different and also similar. However, it's all based on the histories between those racial groups, and that's very different when we're looking at different racial groups. Now, institutional racism is by far the most impactful type of racism when we think about the amount of people that it affects, really. And when we talk about institutional racism, Sir William Macpherson defined institutional racism as the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. And it can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour that amount to discrimination through prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. Another definition of institutional racism is discrimination or unequal treatment on the basis of membership of a particular ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalised, and it's arising from systems, structures or expectations that have become established within an institution or organisation. Within the United Kingdom and really in many other countries worldwide, the research has shown that institutional racism is rife across the different systems. So when we think of the criminal justice system, as a black person, you're more likely to have excessive force used with police interactions, more likely to be given a custodial sentence, and also longer custodial sentences given compared to a white person engaging in the same crime. When we look at mental health services, you're more likely to have a higher dose of antipsychotic medication administered, you're at higher risk of sectioning, regarded more dangerous, harder to treat and aggressive, and also more likely to remain in long-term inpatient rather than receiving community care. And again, in the medical field, directly related to autism, it's harder to get a diagnosis. When we look at maternal health, you're more likely to die during childbirth, 4 times more likely as a black woman, twice as likely as an Asian woman. And general accessibility of medical information is a lot more difficult. And when you look at the kind of diagnostic manuals and seeking advice, whether it's online, NHS Direct, that kind of thing, those systems are more catered towards white patients and white skin, and it's more difficult when you have black or brown skin to access the same information. When looking at the education sector, which a lot of people will work in as behaviour analysts, you're more likely to be permanently excluded as a black student, more likely to have negative language such as problematic used against you, and the impact of racist stereotyping amongst students. We've recently had the case of Child Q. If no one's aware of that, then it's definitely one to look into. And when the safeguarding report was done on that, racist stereotyping was one of the factors that that resulted in what happened to that young lady. And then the employment sector, where ethnic minority individuals are more likely to be overlooked for jobs. And research shows you have to submit 60% more job applications before even getting to the interview stage. And the main reason for that really is actually names. So just submitting a job application with your name and ethnic origin results in you less likely being put forward for an interview for a job. Now, the Equality Act of 2010 was devised really to legally protect individuals from discrimination in the workplace and wider society based on historical issues being faced by ethnic minority people. And within the Equality Act, there are 9 protected characteristics, 2 of those being race and disability. When we talk about intersectionality, what we know is that discrimination occurs on multiple levels and creates a unique experience for those individuals that identify with more than one of the protected characteristics. So, for example, as a woman, I am susceptible to being discriminated against for my gender, whether in the workplace or in wider society. However, as a Black person, I'm also susceptible to being discriminated against because of my race. So as a Black woman, my experiences with discrimination will be completely different to the experiences of, for example, a white woman, although we are both women. So that's what we're really talking about when we talk about intersectionality and the multiple levels and ways in which you can experience discrimination for different reasons. And what we do know is the services and systems that we spoke of earlier in terms of the criminal justice system, the medical field, education system, etc. Within all those services and all those systems, there's a lack of awareness and education and also equal treatment of autistic individuals. So when you have an autistic individual who also happens to be from an ethnic minority background, for example, Black, these systems then have to be navigated with the hurdles faced by all people that either have autism or another disability, as well as the hurdles faced by all people that may belong to an ethnic minority background. And as behaviour analysts, we know, we like to, or it's a good idea to use the principles that we know and we've learned in order to explain behaviour and how it's reinforced and how it's maintained within society. And we know we can use these principles also in order to understand racism and its prevalence and maintenance within society. So when we look at respondent conditioning, essentially you have an unconditioned stimulus. In this example, we'll take food, which elicits an unconditioned response of salivation when presented. If you present a neutral stimulus, for example, a bell, you'll get no conditioned response, so there will be no salivation at the presentation of a bell. However, when you present them simultaneously and you have the unconditioned stimulus of food and the neutral stimulus of a bell, that unconditioned response of salivation will still occur because of the presence of the unconditioned stimulus of food. Now, if you present them simultaneously and repeatedly, the bell then turns into a conditioned stimulus, which elicits a conditioned response, such as salivation. Now, we can relate this and to racism and give us some understanding. So in terms of an unconditioned response, in this example, if we use violence, and that can be any sort of depictions of crimes, etc., that we are exposed to, whether it's in newspaper articles or whatever. So that unconditioned response of that unconditioned stimulus of violence will elicit an unconditioned response, such as fear, and this could be in any sort of physiological representation, whether it's sweaty palms, racing heart, etc. And if you present a neutral stimulus, such as a Black person, you'll have no conditioned response. So there will be no fear. However, simultaneously being presented, the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus of violence plus a Black person, you will have that elicitation of the unconditioned response of fear. And if you do this repeatedly, a Black person then becomes a conditioned response, eliciting a conditioned response, a conditioned stimulus of Black person, then elicits a conditioned response of fear. Now, how that relates into us and society, obviously living in a country where there is a majority race and there is ethnic minority race within the country, essentially that means there are a lot of people within the country that may not be in any close proximity to minority ethnic groups, and therefore their exposure and knowledge of minority ethnic groups can only be what they're exposed to in terms of films, programs, media coverage. So when we think of respondent conditioning, we think of the negative depictions and portrayals of ethnic minority individuals within the media and within films and programs, etc. That would be the only kind of experience or exposure for a lot of people within the country. And if we think of policing, as a police officer, you're not allowed to police in the area in which you live. So you have a lot of police officers that are policing in inner city areas such as London, which has the highest population of minority and ethnic people, but the people that are policing in these areas are not from those inner city areas. And you can also reverse this and apply this to victims of racial abuse. So for people who are aware of and experienced and see the racism experienced in certain systems, it can make it very daunting in order to then have to step into those systems to either access support or help or advice, really, for whatever it is that you may need in order to contact those services. So then we move on to stimulus generalisation. And essentially, a response whose probability of occurrence has been increased by any conditioning procedure will also tend to occur in the presence of stimuli similar to that which prevailed at the time of conditioning. Now, if we relate this to racism and we look at the respondent conditioning that we just spoke about, so you have a conditioning procedure such as respondent conditioning, and in this sense, you've got the response, which would be fear. The probability of occurring has been increased by respondent conditioning. Now, the prevailing stimuli at the time of conditioning, for example, being a black person, and similar stimuli would be other black people. So looking at the definition of stimulus generalisation, fear, whose probability of occurring in the presence of a black person has been increased by respondent conditioning, will also tend to occur in the presence of other black people. And that's really kind of important in terms of experiences of just one person or one thing you see, how that can then spread to a group of people. And so when we spoke earlier about discrimination and prejudice, how that can be that, you know, you might have a certain exposure or experience with one person, and how that can then spread to a group of people that share common characteristics. And these generalizations can take form across various stimuli, but have a huge impact on how people are treated. And it can be, again, speaking of TV shows and depictions of black people or ethnic minority people, and it can take form in things like the way people dress, certain hairstyles, the way people talk, even down to certain cars that are driven by people or associations that they may hold. Now, observational learning is something that's really, I feel, definitely impactful when it comes to children, and not to say that it doesn't impact adults also, but in terms of racism and racist behaviour, a lot of things that are heard or said or even shown by very young children, and it's very clear that this is not from an informed perception, this is from something that's been seen or heard that's being repeated. So when we talk about observational learning, we're looking at direct observation of others' behaviour and modelling it. So it's really important in terms of observational learning that we're always conscious of modelling appropriate behaviour, making it clear what's acceptable and what isn't, and ensuring that we're not reinforcing inappropriate behaviour also. And when we talk about reinforcement, naturally we're thinking of operant conditioning. So when we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about a stimulus being added or removed following a behaviour, increasing the future probability of that behaviour occurring. And talking of punishment, we're thinking of a stimulus added or removed following a behaviour, decreasing the future probability of that behaviour occurring. And when we look at racism, really what we see is the reinforcement of racist behaviour. And generally, it's kind of like in the workplace, in those group social situations, and almost that social acceptance where a lot of reinforcing of racist behaviour occurs. And whether it's using racial slurs or making racist jokes that are passed off as banter in the workplace and things like that, and even up to the point of causing physical harm to others, and having others kind of either excuse or praise that sort of behaviour. We've recently seen a mass shooting in the States at the moment, which was racially motivated, and also direct discrimination of not wanting to be involved with or involve other racial groups in a group situation. That can be very reinforcing. It can be reinforcing to have that social acceptance from the majority versus doing the opposite and not having that social acceptance. And when we look at punishment, in terms of engaging in anti-racist behaviour, what we've seen and what's been more public, especially of late, so what we've seen is the research shows that in terms of reporting racial abuse, this is minimal, and generally because victims of racial abuse, when reported, are often labelled as troublemakers, and in the work environment that makes it very difficult in order to do so, and racial abuse being reported seldom being taken seriously or being consequated in a way that really shows the severity and impact that it causes. And then you have other people that engage in anti-racist behaviour, not necessarily victims of racial abuse, but it could be white people that stand up and speak up against anti-racist behaviour. We've seen this almost negative concept of the word being used, woke, for people that kind of stand up and speak up about racial issues. So it can be really punishing from a social perspective if you're put down for engaging in anti-racist behaviour, which naturally makes it a lot harder to engage in that behaviour and also report racial abuse. And we've also seen the media response to certain issues in society at the moment, and different organisations making a stand towards racial awareness and racial bias and ensuring kind of equality within their organisations, then publicly being classed as virtue signalers and woke, and people threatening to boycott certain organisations, etc. So operant conditioning also has a huge impact in terms of racism. Now, moving forward to the impact of racism and autistic individuals. A study published by Roman Iretsaru in 2020, they analysed 2017 data for England's National Pupil Database for more than 7 million children aged 5 to 19. And over 119,000 of those students were diagnosed with autism. Of those, autism prevalence was highest amongst Black children. What they did find was children that spoke a language other than English at home were less likely to have an autism diagnosis, and those with English than those with English as their primary language. Another study conducted by the National Autistic Society, where they published a report in 2014, and essentially what they were looking at, they reached out and they were looking for the experiences of Black, Asian and minority ethnic autistic people in the UK, really to establish the reasons for lack of appropriate support that was being given and their struggle to get diagnosis. And a few different findings within this report were that primarily the main challenge was related to their child's autism, as with any parent of children of autism. Although what they did find, there were additional challenges faced that were directly related to their ethnic background. Now, the challenges in diagnosis, initially a lot of parents, carers, etc. were reliant on schools in order to put them onto the diagnosis pathway. And often within schools, children were labelled with behaviour issues. The assumptions that have been found in other research in terms of assumptions that black boys are badly behaved and more liable to school, and also more liable to school exclusion, curtailed and almost made it more difficult in order to get that autism diagnosis. There was often a misdiagnosis of emotional and behavioural difficulties, and similar to the last study that we spoke of, speaking another language is often attributed to cause of language delay. In terms of external views within their own communities, it was really based on a lack of knowledge and awareness of autism. So within these ethnic minority communities, a lot of people were advised on kind of physical discipline, talk of sending children back home in the sense of whichever country they originated from. And this is something I've seen in my practice as well, working with diverse cultures. There is, in some countries, a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding in disabilities, especially such as autism. And I've had clients say to me, you know, moving to this country, this is something I've only experienced since I've been here. And, you know, we have friends, a lot of friends who their children have been diagnosed with autism, but this doesn't exist back home. So, you know, plans to move back home because it may change the issue, because it must be an issue related to being here. Shame and blame and stigma. A lot of countries have a lot of stigma and ostracise families of children with disabilities, especially disabilities like autism. And for myself, we have a family friend growing up who they had a child who had autism, and they were ostracised as a family and really had to hide away their child, and had family living over here, so sent that child to live over here with their family so they could access services, and in order to have that child have a better life. But essentially, with these views and lack of knowledge and awareness, it creates for a lack of community support. And as I said earlier, London being having the highest population of ethnic minority people, ethnic minority groups tend to live and reside in areas in close proximity to each other. So that lack of community support within their own community was also impacting on access to services. Now, in terms of accessing support, you also have language and communication barriers. And if you think of the amount of information and resources that are handed out to families when you have that diagnosis of autism, if there's a language and communication barrier, that makes it that much more difficult in order to access this, and that engagement with professionals also that may not have the ability to communicate with you on a level which you'd be able to understand. So a lot of families often rely on interpreters, but again, interpreters don't necessarily have the awareness or education based on disabilities or education or that specific issue, but they are just interpreters. So they've been found to be asserting their cultural beliefs, and they're having their misunderstandings being translated when they're working as an interpreter. So a lot of the times family rely on other family members, and at times this can be siblings. So we're talking young children, primary school age, that are interpreting for parents during meetings with professionals to talk about a child's needs and support that's being offered. I recently came across a case where a child had moved to a different area, and their case had been placed within SEND services, and whoever's desk this child's file landed on saw the family name and without speaking to the family, assumed an interpreter was needed. And this file kind of got left for a year. So a child was left out of education for a year until the file was passed on elsewhere, for another person to pick it up, to find that they're waiting for an interpreter. And it took for someone else to pick it up to say, well, let me just try and engage with this family and see where we can go from there. And at that point, realizing that this is a British born family, who were not in need of an interpreter, but for that reason, and almost that racial bias of just seeing a name and making assumptions, this child had been out of education for a year. So these kind of impacts when it comes to support and accessing services can be really detrimental. Now, in terms of professionals, a lot of families reported of being treated in patronising manners and not being listened to, and at times having loud and passionate communicators labelled as aggressive. And there are some cultures where people do communicate in a very loud and passionate manner, and what we know from the research is, you know, the angry black woman trope of, you know, being perceived as aggressive and confrontational, even just when being assertive. So again, this is where racism kind of falls into the impact of service provision for autistic individuals. As service providers, it's always important for us to question what we're using and how we're kind of providing services. And if we look at the curriculums we use within behaviour analysis, the curriculums often consist of westernised norms and expectations. And so it's our job as professionals to make cultural considerations. So we should really be asking the families of the learners that we're working with for information on anything that we may not be aware of. And it won't always be the case that it will be possible for us to make these cultural considerations, and it won't always be the case that families will want to even account for these. However, the level of respect shown in making those considerations and having that forethought to speak to families almost creates a better relationship, and also allows for that conversation as to why, if something isn't possible, why it's not possible, why it's not in the learner's best interest, because we've already made that consideration. It's not something that wasn't on our radar and a family have brought to us and then we just saying, well, no, it doesn't work for us. It kind of shows that we're a step ahead and we're making those considerations. And in terms of curriculums, we're looking at things like eating with cutlery, which in some cultures, that's not the way. Some cultures, people eat with their hands, and it may be a case that yes, we need to teach that also, but are we also accounting for the cultural considerations of how that learner may engage in certain behaviours at home? What might be the norm at home? Are we considering that? Something like eye contact, which was brought up in the last talk with Virginia, and it's something that's always kind of referred to in terms of autism, but you know, in some cultures, again, it's not socially acceptable to make eye contact with adults as a child. So is that something that we should even be considering, let alone pushing for, or not considering cultural differences in that sense? And when we look at self-help skills, there are always cultural and religious considerations, and it could be around toileting and grooming, and especially working with young adults, and we're teaching that independence. When we look at hair care is very different for white learners than it would be for black learners. So are we looking at the differences? Are we educating ourselves in those differences when we're teaching people how to engage in these behaviours of self-help and grooming? And when we look at the materials that we use, again, cultural considerations, we need to be contacting families, especially when teaching out of the home environment. So whether you're teaching in the school environment, we often teach kind of self-help skills and independent skills in the school environment or clinic setting, out of the home. But when we think of even looking at things like VB programs, and we're looking at foods and clothes and common items, are we involving families within these choices? Are there materials for foods that are common in that learner's environment at home, or their clothes or common items that we may have no awareness of because we don't have that shared cultural background? However, that is part of their environment and that's part of their norm, and that should be included in their individualized program. Do we have materials to depict these things? Do we know how these items, foods, clothes, etc. are pronounced, and are we pronouncing them properly when teaching? And even when we look at feeding programs, are we involving families in the sense of what foods are culturally different to what we are used to, that may be a huge part of that learner's background and kind of experience. So it's really important in terms of all levels of teaching that we are involving families in order to establish what is actually right for that individual. And especially things like also greeting. So, you know, we know that we greet people, sometimes we shake hands, etc. But there are different methods of greeting people in different cultures. And these, again, are things that we should be considering. When we look at resources, so another thing is kind of looking at how we're protecting our learners from harm caused by racism. And what we know is the topic of racism is very complex and it's a minefield within itself. And within just neurotypical kind of mainstream school environment, it's seldom covered really. So that's one side of things. However, as a member of an ethnic minority group, it's essential to teach your children about racism because they're likely to experience it. So in terms of the things that we're looking at and the resources we're looking at, what resources are available for families or professionals of autistic children that will experience racism in order to teach it, and beyond just teaching, how to deal with it, because racism and the impact of it can have a huge toll on your mental health. However, again, there's a lack of resources on accessible resources, how to teach to deal with those kind of impacts of racial abuse on your mental health. And these again are things that we kind of need to be looking at. And when we look at conduct as professionals working in the field, we know within our ethics manual, we're not allowed to accept gifts, food, drinks, etc. from clients. This can be considered highly offensive in certain cultures. So again, looking at the impacts of everything that we're following in terms of materials, curriculums, ethics and codes, and how that can impact the diverse community in which we serve. Even greetings, are we accounting for different religious and cultural considerations when we're looking at how we greet our clients or their families, etc.? When you're working in diverse religious backgrounds, it may not be appropriate to shake people's hands when you look at some religious and diverse backgrounds. And for those that we have to step into people's homes, again, small things like taking your shoes off. I know personally I always travel with a spare pair of socks in my bags. I don't even ask if people would like me to take my shoes off. If I haven't got socks on, I've got my spare socks. If I step in someone's house, I just take my shoes off. That's it. So having that awareness and kind of having more of an understanding of people's cultures and backgrounds before working within the community. Now, in terms of services and service provision, as service providers, whether it's schools, whether it's clinics, whether it's outreach programs, we also need to be looking at how informed we are, because I've had clients reach out to me to provide services because they didn't feel their existing service provider was aware or sensitive to their cultural or ethnical needs. That's not necessarily a good thing. Just because I share your ethnic background does not mean I'll be the best service provider for you. and really it limits you to your accessibility to services. So in terms of making sure that that's not even a need or a question for people looking for services, we need to ensure as service providers that we're educating our staff and ourselves and asking the right questions during intake to show people that actually we're making these cultural and ethical considerations before taking you on as clients. Providing regular staff training and awareness is imperative for serving a diverse community. As much as we kind of provide training on disability awareness, we need to kind of respect all different levels of impact on the individuals that we'll be serving. Reviewing our policies and procedures, ensuring diversity efforts at all staffing levels within organisations, and making sure that cultural awareness is accounted for, and essentially creating environments that are not just welcoming and inclusive, but also knowledgeable, and equipping our staff to serve diverse communities. Because awareness of issues faced by families, different issues or additional issues faced by families, will impact the way in which we support families when we provide services. So often we advocate and fight for disability awareness and rights, which is of course the right thing to do and how we should all be moving forwards, but sometimes we ignore the complex paths that differ for some of the individuals due to intersectionality. So we must ensure that we're educated in order to advocate for all our learners and their families also.
Thanks, Sheila. Sorry, my screen shifted to a bigger screen. It threw me for a second. Thank you so much for that. I know when we first discussed this presentation, one of your concerns was like bringing to the fore that was quite a challenging question for the audience, right? About how racism exists, and we have to own that. So thank you for, again, I mean, I think Virginia's talk was very kind of exposing for her, and I think in regards to us as a population of professionals and parents, and then a couple of parents in the audience as well, that this is something we have to take into account. There were obviously lots of comments within the group, which I don't think you can see when you're presenting, so I'm just going to relate these to you, and there's a few questions. So one of the questions that came from one of our attendees was they were saying they're working in an ABA school. There's several students who come from ethnic minorities, but the large majority of the staff are white. And the question is, do you think there are specific barriers that prevent those from ethnic minorities going into the field of behaviour analysis, and how can we help those be overcome?
Yes, I think looking at higher education, there are specific barriers, and there's a reason why there's, you know, just a few Board Certified Behaviour Analysts that are Black within the UK. How can those be overcome? I think kind of that awareness and education. I think the first step is kind of awareness of the barriers that are faced for all ethnic minority people when it comes to higher education, first and foremost. And what we see in behaviour analysis is that at the lower level, when we look at tutoring and things like that, there's a very diverse community of Black and ethnic minority people working as tutors. But that step up in terms of higher education and becoming board certified, that's where the barriers come into place. And if you're in a position where you have that ability to accelerate people, then that's what you need to do. From my personal experience, I've worked in organisations, ABA schools, etc., where I ended up in positions where coming into an ABA school, I had vast experience compared to others that were coming in, and I was training people to take higher roles, and I was never put forward for the higher roles. So there are these barriers within organisations. And I think when organisations are happy to address that, accept that, and kind of put things in place so that's not the case, that's the only way forwards, really. It's not something that individually people can really do. I was fortunate to come across some amazing people that were very supportive in my career path, but that's not the case for everyone.
No, I know we had met for the first time at a different conference recently.
Yeah.
And one of the conversations we were having was I find it hard to understand, right? I just like truth on the table, because I don't sit, obviously it's not from my perspective. And that's one of the things I think everyone's gonna have to get really on board with, isn't it? That the environment selects different behaviors for different people, and in this case you've shone a light on the racism aspect, or possibly discrimination or the bias. So I wonder how much overt racism we'd encounter in our professional lives, but I wonder whether this unconscious bias definitely exists. And in the case of the example you just gave, you're talking about I guess discrimination, right? Like you felt you were passed over on the basis of your color of your skin.
Yeah. And this is the thing, is like experiences, speaking to other people within the field, it's all similar experiences, and essentially people just end up branching off on their own, because there isn't that opportunity for progression within organisations. So you're better off kind of going off on your own, setting up your own thing, and moving forwards. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's the way it is for now.
Yeah, on the I guess pulling it back to behaviour analysis now, and thinking about some of the determinants, if you like, of behaviour analysis, and thinking about the central tenet of environment selecting behaviour. You spoke earlier about the responder conditioning that affects us all, right? We're all subject to that is happening in front of our eyes every day. And in fact, since your talk where you made similar points, I've been observing TV in a very different way. It's had a real impact on me in that sense. So I guess what I'm driving at is, given the respondent conditioning, and particularly in relation to what I guess I say this sort of guardedly, but the best case scenario that it's driving unconscious bias, right?
Yeah.
And I say that really ironically. What do you think are the behavioural challenges that we face? I mean, what are the changes that we could see on a kind of day-to-day stimulus to stimulus position? And this is a huge question for one person, and this is the challenge to the field. But what do you think are the things that need to be considered, addressed, changed, in order to kind of, I guess, change that kind of what's the word? It's not the rhetoric, because maybe it is. Maybe it's the scripts. Maybe it's the casting. Maybe it's the representation. Like,
it's 100%. It comes down to representation, and what we've seen really since 2020 is a much wider representation, positive representation. But then, when we think of the education system, which starts from when children are very young, there's not much representation, positive representation of Black or ethnic minority figures beyond the really kind of standard people that we all know of. Curriculums don't involve, there's so much that's not taught, and so much that's not learned about by people, that it starts very young and it continues. So by the time we get to the point of, we're celebrating adverts that have Black people in, and other people are like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous, why have they put Black people in adverts, like this is so woke, that shows, when I see comments like that, it just shows how ridiculous it is that you can notice when there's a Black person in an advert. But I notice it because I go, oh my gosh, like there's an advert that's got like a Black family. That's crazy, because you just don't see that. Whereas on the flip side, people say, why are they doing that? It's virtue signaling. It's so woke. I'm going to boycott that environment. And it's like, you don't see that the fact that you notice it tells you this is not the norm, And so until people are depicted as normal, just families that go shopping or, you know, go to Argos or Sainsbury's or Tesco, then it's only going to be because we're so used to negative depictions of Black and ethnic minority people. You know, if all we're used to is seeing brown people are terrorisms, Black people equals gang violence, you know, if that's all we're used to seeing, then naturally, what else are we going to think? So it is all down to representation. But it's got to be a huge shift, mainly within the education system from the age of 5 onwards. Like, who are we learning about in school? What histories are we learning about? Is it honest? Is it, you know, is it for what it was? Because that's when people, a lot of the time, people have no idea about a lot of histories and a lot of impact and, you know, what we're being exposed to. And until everyone is shown that, will people really sit back and go, oh, okay, well, maybe I've got this a little bit wrong, you know?
This might be a bit of a naive question, so apologies if it is, but like the things that you were talking about and representing within your talk were speaking to me on the basis of the societal constructs, right? So you've got your institutional racism, you've got the, we just discussed, representation dilemma. And I know that you work in London primarily, right? So do you see variations, different behaviours selected in different parts of London, given what the ethnic or racial makeup of that area is? Do you see differences in delivery of services? Does education look slightly different? Are curriculums different in those pockets?
Yeah, 100%. And although these kind of, you know, the institutional racism occurs across the UK, when I'm working in outer London areas, there's a lot less of acceptance, addressing, or even knowledge of. So when I'm working within inner city areas, you know, I'll walk into schools and they'll have displays of like Black Lives Matter, and you know, they will have a lot more representation in terms of what their topics are. And I can see this just by walking around the schools and looking at their displays in terms of their representation and what they're teaching their kids, who they're teaching their kids about, versus I don't live in London, so I live on the outskirts of London. And, you know, even in my own child's school, I walk around, I look at the displays, and, you know, when my child comes home and things, and I'm like, oh, that's sad, you know, because there's so many things that they could be learning that they're just not. So
right, because in the case of your child or other Black or ethnic minority children in those types of environments, their I guess creativity isn't reinforced in the same way, or their, I guess, to use less behavioural terms, like their self-worth isn't reinforced in the same way, and maybe that perpetuates that same issue.
Yeah.
And I remember I think it was in your talk where you, in another one, for those that weren't there, that we represented a video where you had two children that I would guess 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah.
And they're showing a Black baby and a white baby. And there was a Black child and a white child in that video, and both chose the Black child as the bad baby. Right? Yeah. I mean, that is so revealing.
Yeah.
Let me just have a look at the other questions that we've had. One person asked about sorry, let me just find it. I'm so sorry. I did make notes of it. Lose them in my notes. It was a question about research. Let me see if I can find it in the chat. Apologies, guys. It was asking to be pointed towards, here we go, able to guide us towards research, possibly a name of a study. And this is around language delay and how speaking other languages being attributed to the cause of language delay.
I can send you, if I send you the studies that I referenced earlier, and then you can pass it.
So Marta, if we will make sure that comes to you, or possibly we might send it to all delegates actually, just because I think that might be very interesting for people.
Yeah.
So another question, if you don't mind, conversation around curriculums. And I think, and you have addressed it, I think. I wanted to reflect it back to what I took around the intersectionality piece, around what children are taught. For example, let's look towards, because there's another question about examples of what could be done better in regards to children and adults that are non or pre-verbal. and so I'm trying to mash these two together. So
Yeah.
So what children are taught, for example, making choices, and let's just say it's a non-verbal child, a non-verbal adult, could a bias in service support, so people that are there to help that person, because assuming that they need additional support, given that they aren't able to communicate in what will be perceived to be a normal sense.
Yeah.
Bias, discrimination, the racist environment, potentially, I kind of feel like that effectively a punished repertoires of choices disregarded. So you kind of have autism, however somebody chooses to communicate, right? And there will be, to a trained eye, communication is happening in one form or another.
Yeah.
So if you're an autistic black child, do you then think it's true that it indirectly or even directly affects functional analysis or assessment? Because on the one hand, given the premise, given the facts and observations you put forward around the propensity to view behaviours that challenge as aggressive, that it could inadvertently affect functional assessment analysis and therefore lead to poor interventions.
I feel like this would be a difficult one for me to answer, because obviously being a black woman, so for me, if I go in to assess a child and functionality of their behaviour, I'm just looking at the functions of the behaviour, right? So
Yeah.
I don't have those racial biases in terms of like, this is just, however, and again, I would like to think as behaviour analysts, that's what we do when we go in. We're not looking at anything else other than the variables dependent on that behaviour. What is the function of this behaviour? What I have seen from non-behaviour analysts are other professionals in the field, whether it's teachers, etc., that no, this child just holds a grudge. Like, he's just he likes to hurt people. This is what he's like, but that kind of thing in an environment where there are children engaging in comparable behaviour that are, well, they have a disability and it's not their fault, right? So I suppose my outlook is biased as a behaviour analyst, as a black woman. I don't go in that sense. And also, I'd like to think all behaviour analysts, because of our education, we go in and we look at behaviour from no other perspective as apart from what's the function of that behaviour. I see it from other professionals, yes, 100%. Yeah, but I'd like to hope that as behaviour analysts we don't. And I'm not saying there's not racial bias within the behaviour analysis field. I'm just saying in terms of establishing functions for behaviour and how we're going to intervene, I'd like to think that we use what we're taught, the skills that we're taught and our knowledge in order to determine that.
I guess in some ways the objectivity of the science saves us from the bias that we might experience in normal society.
I'd like to hope so, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, Sheila, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I'm very pleased to know that you're coming back for the panel session at the end of tomorrow.
Yes.
So thank you again for kind of bringing to the fore another challenging area, another challenging subject. And I know that you have had a great impact on all of our audience. So thank you again. Have a great day. Hope you can stick around and attend the rest of the conference.
Yes.
If not, we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, Sheila.